When I think back to the toys of my childhood in the very late 80s and the early 90s, I'm often surprised by how many of my favourite toys were all produced by the same toy company, Kenner. It's incredible to me to see just how many diverse lines that this one toy company were producing and the amount of licenses they'd picked up and took a gamble on. There are certain properties that on paper seem like a pretty bad idea for a toy company to invest in. Properties like Aliens, for example, definitely seem to be aimed at a much more mature audience than is really appropriate for children. After all, most of their core audience would not have even been able to see the film. And yet somehow Kenner managed to make it work and turn these properties into very successful toy lines. Another example like this is the Beetlejuice line, because although there would later be an animated series aimed at children, Kenner produced a line of toys to tie in with the film. Again, on paper, this seems like a bit of a strange idea since this isn't really a film that was marketed towards children. And yet, as a child, I did see this film and I absolutely loved it, even though a lot of the content and the context flew over my head. And so it was that I ended up with my own collection of Beetlejuice toys from Kenner. And today I'm going to take a look back at some of these toys that I owned, and in particular the Vanishing Vault playset. But to start off with, I'll focus on two of the Beetlejuice action figures that I owned. Now sadly, the packaging has been lost to time in my own collection, so I will have to rely on a couple of stock photos here for the card art. But as you can see, these were fairly simply designed cards with an awful lot of white space. What we see is this zigzaggy sort of curtain effect, I think that's what it's meant to be, in black and white with a green hue over it. So I think it looks quite striking to the eye, and what we see in the top right hand corner is an illustrated image of what the figure is supposed to represent. So these are really nicely painted. This was obviously the style at the time, and I've always been a huge fan of the illustrated artwork on action figure packaging. Now, the figures themselves are roughly about 5 inches tall and are quite stylised. They're usually moulded into one key position, even though they do have articulation. And to me, what I've always found quite surprising is just how faithful they are to their on-screen counterparts. This is quite unusual for toy lines of this time to see this level of accuracy and authenticity in action figures. And for the most part, the sculpts and the paint apps are really nicely done. As I said, these figures are moulded into one key position really, so there is a slight compromise between articulation and the amount of poses you can put them in. That said, if you're quite happy to have this as a mini statue on display, this actually looks pretty good even by today's standards. And speaking of articulation, he does have a swivel at the head, so the head can spin right the way around if you want it to. There is usually a point of articulation at the shoulder, allowing the arms to swivel up and down, and another swivel at the hips, allowing those legs to kick up and back. Now these are 90s toys, so of course they do have action features. In this case, the head can be lifted up and down, and most of the Beetlejuice's heads are swappable, so you can peel it off and reveal another head underneath. In this case, we have the snake-like head that we see in the film, so of course we're recreating that look. But if you wanted, you could take another head from another Beetlejuice and you can put that on here, and this looks pretty good. You have a pretty authentic looking Beetlejuice from the movie. These figures also tend to come with a minifigure, a miniaturized rubber toy. In this case, it is a miniaturized version of the big snake version of Beetlejuice. Here's another figure from my collection. This time, this is Beetlejuice from the end of the film when he's getting married. So this is him in his groom's outfit. And again, it's pretty faithful to what we see on screen. They've actually done quite a nice job of this, especially when we look at the head sculpt. I think this is a particularly good likeness of Michael Keaton. In fact, I wish they'd had this sculptor working on the Batman line. This figure's action feature is the fact that you can spin his head right the way around or move it from side to side really quickly. Underneath, there is a miniaturized head from when Beetlejuice has a shrunken head at the end of the film. And so we come now to the Vanishing Vault. This is one of the few playsets that Kenner produced for their Beetlejuice line, and it is essentially the graveyard in which we first meet Beetlejuice. The branding, of course, is very similar on the packaging as we saw from the single carded figures, but we do have this rather wonderful illustrated image there, which I think is really evocative of the film, but also makes the toy seem really kind of fun and ghoulish, which is absolutely fantastic. So I really like this, I think it's great. At the ends of the box we can see a very small photograph of the toy, and one thing I should point out is that this is a really small, compact little box. It's quite unusual for a playset of the time because it doesn't have that oversized packaging. It's actually very condensed. And then of course on the reverse of the packaging, again, we have that photograph there showing the figure in action, the playset in action, and some of the action features that are associated with it. As playsets go, this is pretty small. It is essentially just one long oblong plastic purple piece, and of course it has the gravestone tucked at the very end of it. Now the sculpting is very nicely done. They've tried to have a little bit of fun with this and make it a bit more toyetic, so we can see sculpted maggots in there, bugs and spiders and all sorts of bits and pieces, which make this a little bit more textured, a little bit more visually interesting. There's not an awful lot in the way of paint apps. It is moulded in that purple colour, but they have highlighted certain parts of it in this sort of luminous green, which gives it a slightly ethereal, eerie effect, which is quite effective. And the same can be said for the headstone itself. This is actually surprisingly faithful to what we see on screen. I actually think they've captured this sculpting quite nicely. They've had a little bit of artistic license, added an extra skeleton in there, but this looks really kind of fun. And again, they've strategically added a green paint wash in key places on the sculpt to give this a really eerie effect, and it's really quite appealing actually. Now, the playset only has one action feature. When you slide open the grave, you will find a hidden alcove in which to place your toy. The interior of this alcove is laid out as if it is a bed for the character to sleep in, and there's some nice stickers here to make this a bit more visually interesting and a bit macabre. So we have a bottle of wine on this dining table, we have a sort of chessboard with cards and a rat on top of it, and then we have some funny books on a bookshelf behind the headrest. Once you're ready, you can take your action figure, you can place him inside this alcove, and then you can neatly close the grave to have him disappear completely. Now, the playset originally came with a big orange plastic sign that said Beetlejuice. This acted as a lever to switch between compartments within the grave, so that when you pushed it to one side, you would release a second trick alcove. This second compartment would be empty except for a tiny minifigure. This plastic minifigure would be of Beetlejuice, and the idea, of course, is that he has been shrunk down to size. And that's basically that. There isn't anything else to this playset, it just has really the one feature, but it is quite a fun idea, and I certainly had a lot of fun with this when I was a child. The idea of miniaturizing your figures was a really fun idea, and there was an element of magic to it, which is kind of fun. And it's a little bit unusual for an action figure line of this time, so it feels a little bit special in that sense too. So there you go. All in all, a pretty weird toy line, a pretty strange idea to bring to toy form in the first place, but actually weirdly kind of successful. I think this is a really nice line and a pretty surprisingly faithful one to what we see on screen. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like and remember to subscribe as there'll be plenty more videos soon.